Welcome to The Forum, your modern-day coffee house, where ideas can be birthed, exchanged, and wrestled with. We celebrate questions, conversation, and reason as powerful tools to enlighten hearts and transform minds, shaping a new generation of thinkers, innovators, and pioneers. We're glad you're here, so pull up a chair and let's begin.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to The Forum. It's good to see you all. So, as promised, the title of this morning's talk is, Has Woke Destroyed the West? Now, ironically, this title is interesting because any of you who understand the concept of woke will realize that woke tend to view the West as it stands as fundamentally a group of pesky white colonizers. But for the sake of today, I want us to kind of look at the idea of the West being this place that fundamentally is the freest and most democratic area still on the planet today, and there's a lot to be thankful for. So, who in this room today hasn't heard of woke? You're probably the luckiest person in here, right? Count that a blessing. So, woke is everywhere, right? It's in schools, it's in workplaces, it's in media, it's in politics. Now, my first experience of woke was probably around 10 years ago now, where I was in a particular situation where I was pulled to one side and was specifically asked to stop using two words. Now, these words I'd used all my life. I had never, ever considered them a problem. They were in the dictionary. There was no malice or offensive kind of rhetoric behind the way that they were being used. It was just that all of a sudden these words were categorized as bad. And I remember the feeling that I had at the time. It was this sense of, this feels really, really strange, because as far as I was concerned, these words had never been a problem before, but all of a sudden they were. And it felt as if the speech that I could use was being compelled, and that just didn't sit right with me. Now, interestingly, a few people today have said they're really looking forward to this morning's talk, mainly because they've heard of woke and they're kind of semi-aware that it exists and kind of what it means. But if they were to ask to fundamentally define what it is, they would really struggle. Well, this morning, what I'd like to do is lay out kind of the history of woke, where it kind of started, and ultimately what it really means, and how we've kind of moved so far away from the original intention of certain things to kind of how we've ended up with this particular ideology. Now, one of the other issues with woke is it's become politically captured. Now, the issue that you have with politics is it becomes this kind of like extreme and polarized opposites. So my concern is that because woke as a concept has become so politically captured, we then fail to actually address the real philosophical and cultural issues that it's causing. So what we're going to do to start today is we're going to basically have a bit of a history lesson to start laying out where woke began. So, is it going to work today? It didn't work for Kev last time, did it? There we go. So, brief history of woke. So, in the 1930s, the word woke began within African American communities and African American circles. And it was first used by Lead Belly's 1938 song, and it warned black Americans to stay woke. Okay, it was a slang term, really. The idea was it was staying woke to racial injustice. And in effect, this made sense at the time because they were going through a particular period where, under Jim Crow laws, racial segregation was really, really, really bad. Then we moved into the 1960s, 1970s era, which was the civil rights era, right? And most of you will know of that era, which is an incredible time in history. And it kind of brought this idea of stay woke back to the fore. And it kind of was the fundamental idea behind the civil rights movement. It was urging awareness of police brutality and racism, again, that had continued under the Jim Crow law period. Now, at this specific time, when the civil rights movement was happening, it was still a grassroots concept. It wasn't an ideology. It wasn't a particular, separate entity. It was really just the idea that a group of people saw that there was a lack of equal treatment to particular groups, and they wanted everybody to be treated as individuals. So then we move into the 1980s and the 90s. Now, this is where it starts to get really interesting, because the idea of stay woke, which was this very specific concept for a very specific time, for a very real issue, started to merge with the ideas of what we call postmodernism and critical race theory in universities. Now, these particular philosophies, so postmodernism, critical theory, started to reshape the way that people interpreted truth, identity, and justice. So for those of you who aren't fully aware of postmodernism and critical theory, I've broken it down into a few categories. So with postmodernism, what we have is the idea that truth is no longer objective, okay? It's a social construct. We have language creates power structures. That goes back a little bit what I said when I was pulled aside 10 years ago. There was an idea that particular words represented particular things based on particular opinions. And reality is filtered through group narratives and feelings. So that's postmodernism. You then have critical theory. Now, critical theory is a society is a system of power relations between oppressors and oppressed. So you can see how we get this separate entity here. There are oppressors and oppressed. You have institutions, laws, even logic are tools of domination. For example, more recently, maths has been called racist, as has gardening. So watch yourself. And justice fundamentally means dismantling those very systems. So recently, I know we laugh, but people were trying to figure out a way of dismantling gardening because they thought it was fundamentally racist, right? So do with that what you will. So these ideas moved from academia, right, so within the classroom, into activist circles. And this is where then we start laying the groundwork for today's woke worldview. Which brings us to, we'll try 3, there we go. 2010s and onwards, which was what I've called the cultural explosion. Now, this is where social media really started to take hold of the world. And I believe social media is an incredibly positive thing. I think it's done the world a lot of good, but I also believe it's done a lot of damage that I think even psychologists yet don't know what that's created for culture as we go on. We're only really starting to scratch the surface of it, right? So woke then becomes, and this is where it changes, it becomes a moral identity. It's no longer stay woke to a specific thing that's happening in reality. It literally becomes a moral identity. It's about signaling virtue and allegiance to progressive causes. Now, the idea of critical theory, which we talked about before, was a society and a system of power relations, and justice, in effect, dismantling those systems. It escaped academia, again, like I said earlier, within the classroom, and it began to infiltrate HR departments, media, and the whole circle of business and society. So the term shifted from being aware of something. 2, and this is where it's really important, ideological enforcement and moral purity. Hear that again. It went from awareness to ideological enforcement and moral purity. Now, going back to the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we had things like the gay rights movement. Again, a really important part of history. Go back even further, we have the female rights movement with suffragettes. That started way back in the mid-1800s. Now again, there's a very similar process happening with those things. What started as a particular goal then moved into what was called second wave and third wave, and you would argue that what is today doesn't represent anything as to what the grassroots idea was. In fact, you even have people saying, I don't like what that's become. That's not what we ever wanted it to be. That was never our intention, right? You hear that a lot. To the point, for example, even within gay rights, we went from the right of 2 people of the same sex not being arrested and put in prison, just the right to exist, being things like rainbow flags on sandwiches, which we were laughing about this week. We have pride parades. And now we have a whole list of letters that's longer than that Welsh town that no one can pronounce. So moving on, we then need to look at the woke worldview, and I've called this justice redefined. You see, woke is no longer just a slang term. Basically, this idea of there's some issues here, you all need to be awake to it because there's problems, right? It's fundamentally become a moral worldview. Now, a couple of weeks back, I did a talk on philosophy for dummies, right? Which I do think is the best title. And in that, we looked at the 3 branches of philosophy. We looked at metaphysics, what's real. We looked at epistemology, which is how do we know. And then we looked at ethics, which is what do we do, right? Now, within the context of woke as a worldview, we can start now to apply those 3 branches of philosophy to the concept of woke. Now, firstly, within the woke moral worldview, this is the most important part. People are primarily defined by their race, their gender, and their sexuality. Okay? So you can see we've already created groups, right? Now the metaphysical part, which is how do we define what's real? Well, this is where it gets really, really difficult because truth is now redefined. It's no longer what actually is, it's what feels oppressive. Now, on the epistemological side, which is how do we know? Well, I think I've gone too far. Oh, no, there we go. Society is fundamentally unjust and oppressive. We see it everywhere. It's just unjust and oppressive. And because we can no longer identify what truth is, because truth has been redefined, we base what truth is on, hear this, lived experience. That becomes the highest authority. So there we go there. So then lastly, we have the ethics, which is what then do we do about it? So we have what's real, how do we know? What do we do about it? Well, if oppression is systemic and it's baked into culture, language, and structures, the goal, therefore, is to dismantle the perceived structures of oppression in order to achieve justice and equality for all. So like I said earlier, if you fundamentally believe the West is an oppressive culture, the goal of the movement will be to dismantle the West. Now, within this, everything is simplified to... Oh, there we go, okay. Everything is simplified under the categories of oppressor and oppressed. That's it. You have oppressor, you have oppressed. Now, you all know in here, the world is not that simple. And to simplify it to that sends you down a really, really problematic road. Let's give an example of this then. So if you have a test, some of you work in the education industry, okay? And again, you might disagree with me on this. I'd be really interested in your thoughts afterwards. Don't throw things at me if you think I'm wrong. If a test has unequal results, especially if those unequal results are within groups that you deem to be oppressed, woke logic would see that as proof of deliberate injustice. Regardless of effort, regardless of ability, regardless of choice, for example, how much investment you're going to have in revising and things like that, there are a whole myriad of factors at play. Equal rules don't matter if outcomes are not equal. See where we're going with this? Let's take another one. The gender pay gap. Do I dare? I once saw an incredible interview, it's online, has millions and millions and millions of views, one of the best interviews I've ever seen. And this particular person was asked, but you do believe the gender pay gap exists? And they say, yes. And they say, so therefore you do believe it's because of why? And they say, no. Well, this goes round in circles, probably for about 15 minutes, right? And this particular interviewer cannot get their head around the fact that this person believes, yes, it exists, but they're trying to put him in a corner that says, well, therefore it then must be because of why. Now, what you find within this discussion is, on one side you have gender pay gap, oppressor, must be because of this. But then what they say is, let me give you 20 other reasons why there potentially may be a gender pay gap, right? It may be that within that there is an oppressor, but you have to deal with that as a standalone within that separate category. There are also 20 other things that may have caused this particular issue to unfold. But you see, again, if the view is everything is viewed through the lens of oppressor versus oppressed, you are going to simplify it all down to it must just be this one reason. The other issue with group identity and simplifying it is this. Let's take a few examples. You're gay. That would be considered an oppressed group. But you're also white with a good job. The oppressor. Which one wins? You're black, an oppressed group, but you're also a multi-billionaire with a private jet. Which one wins? You're female, oppressed, but white and a CEO of a multi-million-pound company. Which one wins? So you see how it starts to become incredibly problematic. So in summary, woke sees the world not as a collection of individuals with their own thoughts and ideas, but as a hierarchy of group identities, fundamentally structured by power, privilege, and oppression. So I've summarized them. We have collectivism. You're defined by your group, race, gender, sexuality, not as an individual. We have power dynamics. All relationships are viewed as oppressor versus oppressed. Life is a zero-sum power struggle. We then have this thing called moral relativism. There is no objective truth. It's only ever perspectives shaped by identity and experience. And then lastly, we have emotional primacy. Feelings override facts. Logic and reason are seen as tools of oppression. Now, the problem is, when these premises start to take over, society stops functioning on the values that initially created the progress and liberty that we see today. In fact, we actually start to go backwards, fragmenting into tribes of emotion and grievance. Now, I'm going to share with a little bit my personal feeling about all of this, in that one of my biggest struggles over the last 10, 15 years, and I saw it play out hugely, particularly within the last 10 years, is the idea that I felt that somehow one competed in society by how a victim they were, no longer by how strong they were. And that damaged me more than you will realize, to the point where I would say, I don't know why I'm getting emotional, flipping heck. I would say I actually began to lose my confidence in every area of life, because I thought that somehow being strong and being able was a problem. So what you start to do is you start to pull back and you start to hide as somehow being an issue. Whereas the truth of the matter is I was brought up to face the world strong, and the idea that no matter what you faced in life, whether it was hardship or difficulty, that you put your shoulders back and you said, despite of the hardship, I've got through. And I always remember when the scripture that said, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. I remember my dad used to say, even though you're going through it, walk through it, because there is the other side. So I found myself wanting to figure out how I could become a victim so I could be seen. Now think about that. Why would I want to find a way of categorizing myself as somehow, well, this is wrong with me, this is a problem? Because I almost felt that the only way I could belong was to define myself by some mark of victimhood. Now, for me, whenever we get to a point in culture whereby victimhood is celebrated more than strength, I feel that we've really hit a problem, and that's something that really needs to be addressed. Which then brings us to the next part, which is equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. Now, in a free society, everyone should have, you should all agree with this, everyone should have the same opportunity to succeed. We all agree, right? Let's make it that everybody, whatever group you are from, you have the same opportunity to succeed. Now, the woke view says unequal outcomes equals proof of injustice. Now, the problem with this view is it leads to hiring by identity quotas, not by merit. We've seen that, right? We have to tick a box. How many gays, how many colored people, how many XYZ. Next is redefining success around group-based averages. And then lastly, we have labeling individual differences as systemic failures. Has any of you ever heard of the Scandinavian Equality Paradox? Anybody? That's a mouthful, that. The Scandinavian Equality Paradox. Well, so many would argue that the Scandinavian countries are seen as the most egalitarian on planet Earth, right? They have done everything they can by means of government intervention to regulate society to try and make it the same, right? By any means possible. They did this experiment over about 5 years, right? Guess what the outcome was? The outcome was the differences increased, not decreased. And the social scientists were absolutely blown away. Why, when an experiment is created whereby, by in effect social manipulation to create the most equal outcome possible, you say everybody has the right to do everything, the world's your oyster, the groups actually got more different, not more the same. And what they understood was, you give everybody the right to pursue their own interest, and you find that people generally pursue very, very different things. Again, I thought that was quite an amazing thing. So to force equal outcomes, freedom, in effect, must be sacrificed. Take the Soviet Union experiment, which is a good one really to look at. Mao's China, similar, they tried to enforce the equality of outcome by implementing such policies like same wages, guaranteed benefits, not based on individual effort, but the idea that everybody should look the same and be the same for the greater good, right? But what happened with the idea of promoting fairness and eliminating class, you ended with diminished incentives, lack of innovation, no longer wanting to achieve or work hard, similar to what I'd said was my kind of story earlier. And this ultimately led to total societal collapse of the regime because they realized it actually didn't work. So moving on, why do we feel so many embraced the woke movement? What was the appeal? Now, every year, we remember the Second World War. It's a massive part of our history, yeah? It's a big thing. It's all over the news. It's in schools. It's something that really has shaped. And in effect, I would argue it should have shaped. It was a huge part of our history, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't remember these periods in time. However, it's a long time ago now, right? And war, in a strange way, not all wars, that particular point in history, kind of has been sold as a peak experience of humanity. That it was almost like that was the time that we fought and we gave our lives and we fought for freedom. You hear it, it's like, you don't know how good you've got it. Like, you should feel bad because you didn't have to die on the front lines kind of thing, right? That's kind of the narrative that we often hear. It was kind of shaped as this idea of nobility, right? Like valor, the sense of laying down one's life for the nation, right? Which again, it was an incredible thing. But also the war brought people together. There was a common enemy to fight against, to defeat, and to win. Now, isn't it interesting that years back, Anth used to talk about the common enemy, the idea that the common enemy is what brings people together. Now, in effect, what we've seen happen since the war, civil rights movement and where we are now, has been an incredible achievement, right? We've seen liberty like no other place on earth. We're almost a victim of our own success in a way. And could you argue that almost life has become so good and so easy that we should start to feel almost ashamed? Well, I haven't really fought for this. Why am I deserving of this wonderful life that I have? This ultimately leads to the idea that, well, should I be needing to sacrifice myself for some cause, for some war? COVID, for example, what did it do? It was a war on a pandemic. You hear it all the time. The war on drugs, the war on X, the war on this. That terminology is that sense of let's all come together to fight a particular cause. There's a common enemy. Let's sacrifice ourselves for the cause, which again leads back to the idea of the morality of altruism. It's no longer about kindness, it's about self-sacrifice. And it becomes your moral duty to suffer for others. So, what if people are just looking for something to fight for? Woke ideology gained traction because it's meeting a particular human need. Moral purpose. It offers a cause to fight for. How about belonging? People crave identity in a tribe. How about simplicity? Life is reduced into a binary, like we said earlier, oppressor and oppressed. It was the same in church. It's all the devil's fault. Wasn't it? Good versus evil. We all said if something's bad, it's the devil. If it was good, it was God. You get the idea. We have status. The idea of performative virtue. This is where social media comes in. We all remember when we all put the black screen on for the issue with George Floyd. And those who didn't, they were literally told silence is violence. If you didn't do it, you were accused of not working towards or being part of the war. And then we have power. The weak gain power by moralizing against the strong. That last one is really important. Now, it's an incredibly seductive framework. Emotionally satisfying, socially reinforced by the group, and it becomes so protected from challenge. Some of the issues that I faced with it, I find I'm worried to say anything because it's almost shielded from any critique. Now, I've heard the term, woke is like a religion. Have you any heard that? Woke is a bit like a religion. Well, I would argue, woke is not like a religion. Woke is a religion. If you look at all of the things that make up woke, it perfectly parallels. It has all the hallmarks of a secular religion. We have original sin, privilege, whiteness, unconscious bias. Let me just use an example. The southern plantations in America, this is where we started in the 1930s. That was an issue with white men. But it doesn't mean that I now own slaves. Original sin. I'm being asked to take on the sins of my forefathers. The doctrine. The doctrine is social justice. Everyone must achieve this at all costs. This is a good one. We have saints and martyrs, victims and activists. Ooh, and then we have heresy. If you disagree, it's hate speech. We have confession, public apologies, confess your sins. And then lastly, which is a really interesting one, is excommunication, the idea of, and we've all heard it, cancel culture and deplatforming. Now, I watched a movie last night, actually, which really made me think about this, the idea of cancel culture. Have you all heard of the Inquisition? Yeah? We've also heard of the witch trials and all of that stuff. I watched a movie last night about the witch trials. It absolutely horrified me, what went on in that time. Horrified me. It was a level of evil that is just, unbearable. But we've come so far away from that, and again, this is what's interesting, because of means of discussion and understanding and reason and logic, as we've understood the idea of individual rights. But to see what people did to people because they were different was just unbelievable. However, we have a little bit of a modern Inquisition going on now, but just played out in a different way. Heretics are no longer burnt at the stake. They're just burned via social media by the mob. They're fired. Reputational destruction. You see? So it might not happen in the same physical way that it used to do, but it's absolutely still happening. There's no due process. Remember, innocent until proven guilty kind of thing. The idea now is allegation, conviction. No room for conversation. Remember, we had believe all X. Insert whatever word you want there. There's no redemption. Apology means you're guilty. And therefore, this is what used to happen last night. Do you confess that you're a witch? It wasn't, yes, okay, we forgive your sins. It was, okay, yes, we'll burn you. And then the last one is control by fear. People begin to self-censor to survive. Whenever you get to the point where you don't feel like you can express yourself because you're worried that you'll be silenced, we really have a problem. I'm going to throw one out here as well. There was a particular incident that happened years back, a horrific incident, an attack, where lots of people lost their lives. And I'll leave you to look into the story, or you can ask me about it afterwards. The reason why this occurred was because a particular security guard who suspected that this issue was potentially going to occur was too scared to say anything because they thought they would be branded a particular thing. So they kept their mouths shut. And ultimately it led to the deaths of hundreds of people. Now, that's one example. You can see that that's a problem, right? When you fear saying something because your fear of what that might mean, you think, I'll stay silent, but it ultimately led to a far worse outcome. And that's only one of those issues that's occurred. Now, like I mentioned earlier, woke has become politically captured, and I struggle with that because woke is not political. Woke is philosophical, right? Now, it's not a left versus right issue. Now, I would argue the woke fundamentally began on what I would say the left side of the political spectrum. However, it has absolutely infiltrated the right recently. Why? Because it's not a political issue, it's a philosophical one. It's an ideas issue, not a political one. So for example, let me just put it out this way. I'm surprised that people are shocked that, shall I just say it? Trump's America and the MAGA movement, right? Let's just be like candid here. When people are shocked that we've got here, I don't understand. I'm shocked at their shock. I'm like, why does this confuse you, right? Because when you have something that becomes such an extreme on one side, right? Ideological extreme. You will eventually get a pushback so hard from the opposite side, you will then have to face that pushback. And you'll be like, but why is there a pushback? And it's because ultimately that side aren't just going to sit back and say, sure, let's just all go this way. They're going to push back with their own version of the same thing. So what we basically have now is nationalist victimhood. All the Americans crying, we're so badly done to, it's so bad. Christians are so badly treated. You hear it all the time, right? Purity tests, outrage culture. I even saw the other day that, comments that we're going back almost to the 60s. If we hadn't have accepted homosexuality, we wouldn't be in this position. I'm being serious. I knew this was coming. And my friends will say, I warned that if the woke movement went too far, we would go back, not forward, right? And now I am seeing people literally say, if we'd have not let people be gay, basically the world wouldn't have collapsed, right? You see how if we'd have not let women work, the world would be fine, right? Come on, we're going back, not forward. It's not good. You've got two sides of the same coin, right? The biggest upset with me on my social media platforms is that I call out the political left and the political right in exactly the same way. And why? Because for me, it's not about politics, it's about ideology, right? Fundamentally, we challenge ideas, and that's how we get change. You see, both are enforcing orthodoxy. Both want to win, right? And this is what politics becomes all about. It's about power and enforcing dogma. At the end of the day, they both reject individualism. Both crave control. And both abandon reason for emotion and for narrative. Now, as we start to bring this to a close, I hope that's been clear for you. I'm going to summarize how we got, or the differences between the original civil rights movement that I started with today and to how we got to what we are now. You will hear a difference in language. I'm going to describe those, and then I'm going to give you the next 20 minutes to discuss some questions around your tables and see what you come up with, right? And then I'm going to conclude. So, look at these differences. Civil rights versus woke, what changed? So, here we go. We have the foundation. Civil rights, individualism, universal morality, equal law. Woke, identity politics, moral relativism, permanent grievance culture. Different vibe. We next have the view of identity. Civil rights, colorblindness, common humanity. Can you remember Martin Luther King? I pray that one day we will not judge people because of X, but by the content of their character. How far we have moved away from that, and it's shocking. It's really not good. Woke, group identity as fundamental, even celebrating segregation. There is now a university in America that has now segregated whites and blacks again to keep them both safe, right? Justice, civil rights, equal treatment under the law. Rosa Parks didn't hate white people. She just wanted to be seen as equal. Woke, equal outcomes through forced equity. We then have the tactics behind it all. The civil rights, dialogue, persuasion, moral appeal was all about conversation, right? We have woke, call-outs, cancellations, and censorship. And ultimately, the end goal. What was the end goal of the civil rights movement? It was this, and I love this. Integration, resolution, and freedom for all. The civil rights movement saw what the founding fathers America envisaged, and they wanted to produce that wholeheartedly. Woke, perpetual activism with zero finish line. There was a book I read recently that said, think of individual rights as a train, whereby you're going from the 1930s and you all get on a train and we all agree that we want to get to a point where everyone is treated as an individual and seen as equal. If you're a woman and you want to be a CEO and not have kids, knock yourself out. If you want to be a woman who stays at home and cooks and be a housewife, knock yourself out. If you want to be a man who stays at home and cooks, knock yourself out. If you want to be, you get where I'm going with this, right? You can do whatever you want to do. But what happened was, the train gradually sped up, sped up, sped up. We started to achieve all these wonderful things. And rather than when we got to a point where we started to see all that happening, someone decided that it wasn't enough, so they slammed on the accelerator. And unfortunately, we've shot through a station and the train has burst into flames and we seem to have lost everything that we were pushing towards. I want to go back to a point where we all come back to the original civil rights spirit that said we're working towards a sense of freedom and equality for all. So I've got some questions for you to ask yourselves. They are this. Number one, have you learned something about woke that you hadn't considered or didn't know? Number two, do you define people more by their group identity or by their individual character? Number three, have you ever judged someone as privileged or oppressive based on their group rather than their individual actions? Number four, do you believe emotion should always override facts, or is it important to step back and think critically? Have I put thinking critically there, or think critically? Number five, when you see unequal outcomes, do you ask why, or do I assume someone was oppressed? Number six, have I confused being part of a cause with actually doing good? And then the last question is, if the values of woke now dominate our institutions, our language, and even how we raise our children, has the West already been destroyed, and we just haven't admitted it yet. If you get through those 7 questions in the next 20 minutes, I'll be very impressed. You've got a selection. Pick which ones most stand out. I hope that's helped clear things up for those of you who weren't sure the movement, and have a good time, and then I'll conclude. Thank you, guys. All right. I hope that's been useful and you've had a good time around your tables. Just before I conclude, that's obviously been quite a deep topic that I've tried to summarize in half an hour, right? There's going to be so many elements that I haven't had time to say, so don't hear what I haven't said, hear what I have said, right? I have lots of varying different opinions on lots of different things, so if you've got any questions, just come and ask me. We might disagree, but I am genuinely interested in things that you may say, when you said this, like, what are your thoughts on X, Y, Z? That's what the forum's about, right? I thought Danny had a great point that when Claire talked about the letting go of your loyal soldier, there are things that have been fought and won that then once they're won, people don't want to let go of that cause, and therefore they fight to keep that soldier active. And that, to me, is where you end up 30 years in the wilderness and everything really starts to decay and you end up with all sorts of problems. Last thing as well, I absolutely believe that there are injustices and unfairnesses in this world. To say that there aren't would be ridiculous, right? But it's how we get further to the equal opportunity, right, as we progress. That's the conversation we need to be having, not ultimately how we force it to occur, like I mentioned earlier. And then the last thing was, I said on the table, was there anything like that, you weren't sure of, or this, that, and the other? And they said, yeah, what words did you use when you said you were pulled aside 10 years ago? So I'll say it because I censored myself. The words that I used were, drum roll please, he and she, man and woman. They were barred, and they have been barred ever since, and I still fall over my mouth to this day trying to use the correct terminology. So yeah, words have been in the dictionary for years because of a particular view of what those words now mean. They became, in effect, censored within a particular context. So to conclude anyway today, I hope you've enjoyed it. I personally believe the West does face a profound crisis in many different ways. Our culture has recently started to unravel as truth is increasingly replaced by narrative, where facts take a backseat to feelings. When this happens, meaningful dialogue dies and society fractures. Freedom itself is under threat when speech is equated with violence, shutting down honest debate and turning every disagreement into a moral battle. Progress stalls when merit and individual achievement are sacrificed to serve ideology, and we reward conformity over excellence. Most dangerously, unity breaks apart when identity becomes the primary lens through which people are judged. This eventually divides us into tribes instead of bringing us all together as individuals with shared values. These warnings are no longer abstract, as we can see play out in society today. We see them in the collapse of trust in our institutions, the rise of censorship and ideological policing that punishes dissent, and the loss of, like I was speaking earlier, resilience, personal responsibility, and reasoned thinking in public life. But the story doesn't have to end here. There is a way forward grounded in the timeless principles that have built the West and the great achievements that we have seen play out over the last 50 years. Instead of judging people by their group identity, we must return to evaluating individuals based on their choices, actions, and, as Martin Luther King said, the content of their character. To reclaim our culture, we must embrace the courage to think for ourselves, to value ideas, and ultimately the pursuit of truth above all else. This resistance must be firm yet measured. We defend Western values not by mirroring the cruelty of dogma or extremes, but through clarity, reason, and principled conviction. If we do this, we can heal the divisions, restore trust, and renew the spirit of freedom and progress that defines the West. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed that and enjoy the rest of your day.